Smash players have a lot of adversaries in and out of the game, but few frustrate us quite like autopiloting. Autopiloting is frustrating not only because it's costly when it seems like the lights upstairs all shut off at once, but also because it's not always clear why the lights turned off in the first place, such that we can really do anything about it. It's a formidable problem because it's not well defined, and the language we use to describe it is imprecise and misleading. A contrast of two recent events motivates this line of thought for me. The first of which was a recent trip I took to the grocery store. I was on my way to get yogurt when I started discussing something with my girlfriend. I got so into describing something to her that I walked straight past the yogurt and started aimlessly wandering around the store. I went into autopilot. My walking became a passive task while my talking became an active task. My intuition took the wheel on my legs while I put all of my attention on what was coming out of my mouth. This already indicates an important clue about understanding autopiloting, which is that autopiloting isn't so much the absence of thought as it is, in the context of Smash, thought devoted to the wrong place at the wrong time. And this seems like a line of thought that's worth pursuing as I consider the second of the two mentioned events, which was my attempt to learn the Belmonts in recent weeks. Autopiloting is something I haven't experienced in a very long time up until I started learning the Belmonts. Ordinarily, I have good and consistent presence of mind, being generally quick to adapt and aware of changing conditions. As I played the Belmonts, though, I noticed an uncharacteristic cycle of failed repetition. I recognized that what I was doing was failing, but kept doing those things anyway. I wasn't not thinking, but realized that, being new to the character, my ability to deal with unfamiliar situations was limited, so my main task became laser-focused thinking about what I should do. In this cycle of failed repetition, there was a parallel to my frame of mind while wandering the grocery store in terms of active and passive tasks. My struggle to think in foreign situations became my active task, while adaptation and general awareness became passive tasks. This makes for a pretty interesting comparison to my Ganon, where my attention is on looking for cues that indicate I need to shift gears and adapt, rather than on thinking about what I should do. That is, you could say my lack of autopiloting as Ganon is a reflection not of my thinking in that moment, but thinking that I've done in the past and have committed to muscle memory. With this contrast in mind, we're starting to get a foothold on the problem. Be it due to frustration, fatigue, panic, or otherwise, the common cause of autopiloting does seem to be having to think when and where you really shouldn't have to, which can ironically lead to a total paralysis of thought and the characteristic bouts of panic and tiltedness. The difference between my Belmonts and my Ganon, and by extension what explains the difference in my scope of focus between the two, is that I had to think really hard about what I was doing and how to solve problems as the Belmonts, as well as my accompanying lack of confidence in my solutions with them, while as Ganon, I already knew what to do and had well-practiced solutions handy. This said, we're now up against two big questions. If there are a wrong time and place to think, then what are the right time and place, and how exactly do we devote our mental resources to the right place and keep our focus on the big picture? To answer the first question, we need to explicitly recognize that thinking is mentally expensive, and reminding us of my dumb grocery store anecdote, there are always both active and passive tasks, and we need to choose our active tasks wisely. To my thinking, the autopilot dynamic is characterized by fixating on what you want to happen, how you want things to play out, and frantically formulating counterplay. Self-centered thinking, in other words. And this manifests in the form of repeating subtly different variations of the same thing over and over and over again, while adapting to changes in the opponent's behavior and conditions go right past you. A classic example is when fighting a newer player who seems to behave at random. You keep trying to bait the unthinking player into your brainiac setups, but you keep failing. It's a classic example of self-centered thinking. This suggests that a complete shift in dynamic is needed, such that your active task becomes adaptation and recognition, and your passive task becomes your counterplay in that you don't have to really think about what you do so much as simply recognize when to shift gears. To answer the second question of how to keep our focus on the big picture, do we just catch ourselves in the moment and focus on actively thinking harder? I don't think so. If autopiloting is our coffin, thinking too hard in an attempt to correct ourselves is the nail that seals the lid. Our intuitive sense that thinking harder will correct our perceived lack of thinking leads to overcorrecting, which yet again just narrows our thinking and spreads our mental resources thin. I think the answer is a mixture of intuition and conscious thought. Thinking needs to occur at some point, but it seems thus far that the middle of a match isn't really the best place for that. Though the way we talk about autopiloting suggests that intuition is the sworn enemy of thinking, intuition comes in two flavors: wrong intuition and right intuition. Wrong intuition is uninformed, primal, and frantic. Right intuition, on the other hand, is the result of when conscious thought, premeditated solutions, and strategies are worked into muscle memory and crystallized into what feels natural, passive, and effortless. These so-called right intuition strategies and solutions I call schemas, and schemas are basically just blueprints that represent different mental gears you can shift to. To use another analogy, think of cooking supper every single night versus cooking a big pot of something and packaging the leftovers. This captures the idea behind and the virtue of schemas. Why cook every time you want to eat if you can just batch cook pre-cooked meals? A schema then, in this sense, is just a pre-cooked meal where you pre-cook solutions and have them ready. We want to make our counterplay and the self-centered aspect of our gameplay largely passive and effortless, so that we can devote our active attention to changes in the match that result in adaptations, so that you can simply shift gears rather than regress to reptilian brain autopiloting. If schemas are pre-cooked meals, then the cues to which you should focus your attention are simply the hunger pangs that tell you which pre-cooked meal to pull out of the fridge, if you'll excuse that extremely lame analogy. If you have to cook in the middle of the match, it's going to come at a cost. And this, of course, isn't to say that thinking is bad in a match in the sense that thinking's been discussed here, since there's no way to exhaustively have a prefabbed answer to every kind of problem, but rather, our sense that it feels wrong to think too hard in a match is justified. Now, everything I've said so far you may have noticed involves fairly long-term solutions and isn't something that immunizes you immediately against autopiloting just having heard it. Though I argue autopiloting has this root cause that I've discussed that can be addressed ahead of time so that autopiloting doesn't occur in the first place, the solution I present here is preventative, not curative. Autopiloting is accompanied by a suite of not-so-fun emotions like frustration, doubt, panic, or just complete mental disengagement, and how you cope with these is entirely a you thing. With this in mind, autopiloting falls under the don't let it happen in the first place category of problems. This all being said, towards the beginning of the video, I mentioned that our language about autopiloting is imprecise and misleading. There are different kinds of intuition and different kinds of and contexts for conscious thought, and the imprecise and misleading language with which we talk about autopiloting is imprecise because it oversimplifies the roles of intuition and conscious thought, and misleading because it makes them adversaries when they're really quite nice bedfellows, so long as you don't put them on the wrong sides of the bed. Now, at last, I think Vermanubis is finally done running, and that I've gotten my point across to the best of my ability. This was quite a bit to unbox, so I hope I managed to make some kind of sense, though I'm sure I missed at least a few points, so forgive me if I did. As always, I really appreciate the time you guys take to hear me, and I hope what I've said was at least more helpful than hurtful. And fickle though I am, my intent for the moment is to finally finish the SmashConceptions where I discuss the topic of improving in spite of and making the most out of a weak scene, or potentially even by yourself. Whatever may come though, I do hope you guys will look forward to it.